friends. Welcome back. Super excited that you're here. We made it through connection. And so you've heard the introduction. We did some brain basics. We got through the connection, your connection with God, connection with yourself, connection with others. And now we're going to get into the P part of the CPR. And the P stands for psychoeducation. This is really, really important. If you understand what's happening in your brain, if you understand that some of the behaviors that you're doing and some of the patterns that you have, it really makes sense based on what you've done in the past and what's happened to you. If you understand all of that, then you can actively participate and you can change. Many times people are riddled with shame and they come to me and they say, you can't believe what I do. And it might take quite a while before they come clean with me and tell me what they're actually doing or have done. But I would expect, and I would say, well, of course you do that. And let me explain to you the psychoeducation and the why, because of how God created our brain. And so there are things like dissociation. And so if you've experienced trauma and horror and heartache and pain, and if it was so bad that there's actually a way that you can go somewhere else and not even be present in the time in the middle of traumatic memories, and people would say, well, that's horrible. But actually, it's how God created our brain so that we could stay safe, so that we could make it through, so that we could get to the other side. But then if we take on those patterns, remember that we create brain damage because of the things that have happened to us, the trauma, and then the sin that others have done or the sin that we do, and then continued repeated choices. Then if we dissociated during a time in our lives when something really horrible was happening, and that became the subconscious behavior that when I wanted to check out, then I check out, then ultimately, that's not going to be in our best interest. And we have to go back and we have to retrain our brain. And if we choose not to with Jesus, then he becomes enough. We heal through the trauma, we repent and we forgive, and then we establish new choices. But in that process, if we decide not to, then my old coping mechanisms, my old strategies that were actually a good thing that kept me alive actually becomes idolatry. And so it is a beautiful process, and it's not one and done. And so I need to explain to you about the P, the psychoeducation. And in the psychoeducation, we're going to have 4 classes. We're going to talk about the brain in general. I want to give you a little bit more detail, and I want to talk about the adolescent brain coupled with more detail in this section. And then after that, there are only, remember, 2 areas of your brain that I'm going to speak to you about. And that's the amygdala, which is our fight, flight, or freeze response in our brain, our response to anxiety. And in that section, there'll be 2, because there's a top down and a bottom up way that we activate that's activated in our brain. And we need to heal through that. So that will specifically address anxiety in your life. And then finally, we're going to talk about the reticular activating system. We will call it the RAS. And that's actually what your brain focuses on. And you can choose and you can teach your brain what it needs to focus on or not. And so that leads us into this class, which, as you can imagine, I'm really, really excited about as we go in and do a little bit more review. I really want these points to stick in you about the brain, and then we'll add to that some more detail. So let's get into it. Again, the quick review. Our brain is organized for survival and simplicity. It's not developed fully until our 20s. It develops from the bottom up. This is meant for survival, the bottom part of our brain. The middle part of our brain, which happens to be where the amygdala is organized, and it allows us to have our imagination and our emotions. And finally, the last part of our brain to develop is our intellect, our cognitive thought processes. And as we go through this class, if you'll remember, I'm going to utilize my hand to talk about our brain. So here's the bottom part. This is the middle part of our brain, and this is the top part of our brain. And so how did our brain develop? And what shapes our brain? And so if you'll remember, we talked about it's like a potter who throws a lump of clay onto the potter's wheel. And as it spins around, then the potter puts pressure to form actually an object. And so this is how our brain is formed. It's by the external experiences that come into our brain. So that being said, then who had access to our brain when we were born? Who was in our environment? As we grew, who had access to our brain? What were the things that we experienced? And if I was young and I had a traumatic experience, if I was neglected, if I was abused, if something bad happened, then during the time that happened to me, actually, then remember the top part of our brain, our intellectual processing, that if this or then that actually wasn't fully developed. And so I may have a lot of trauma or a lot of things that were affected in my gut, in my emotions, in my imagination that I haven't yet given words to because they happened at an age where that part of my brain wasn't fully online. And so a lot of times kids are exposed to things that they don't have words for and that they can't process in their mind. They can't store that memory as past. And that's what happened in that time. They can't make sense out of it. They don't have the narrative to that. And so it's really important for us then to understand all of those components of our brain. And so every experience, again, everything that happens to you, everything comes through your brain. Whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, it's our brain that actually brings things into our awareness. And those are the things that actually shape our brain. And so there are really key times for brain development in our lifetime. And so if we think about when we're born, we can't survive alone for the first year to about 7 years. We have to be totally reliant and dependent upon a caretaker. And so again, the access that they had to us and the way that they shaped our brain can linger into our adolescence and into our adulthood. If we're not aware of it, then the horror or the heartache or the pain or the suffering or the things that happen to us, even if it's not 100% accurate, our interpretation of that can actually impact the rest of our life. And so if you remember the story that I told about the little girl who was jumping on the bed and her daddy came in and he said, higher, higher, jump to me and I'll catch you. And then he stood to the side and watched her fall to the floor. If you could imagine, she didn't have the cognitive capacity to think about, well, my dad's been hurt in the past. It was just my dad. He's really sick and he needs help. She actually probably took that on and internalized it as shame and pain and trauma. And that, if not resolved, could affect the rest of her life in relationships. She could be one that has insecure attachment. And so that's a real key critical time in our life when we're dependent upon caretakers. And if our caretakers haven't healed, if they haven't gone through a journey of restoration, if they don't know whose they are and who they are, if they haven't healed from the trauma from their past, then that thing gets passed down to them and they pass it to us. And then we have environments that we create when we're cognitively capable of controlling our environment. And because of the horror and the heartache and the pain and the shame and the sin and the things that have happened to us, then we recreate that if we're not healed. And so that's the good news of this class. No matter what's happened in your line of heritage, no matter what's happened to your grandparents or your parents or to you, you can stop it now. The buck can stop with you. You don't have to allow that thing to continue. You can do the hard work that's needed and necessary to create a healthy and a safe environment. And because of neuroplasticity, we've learned that it doesn't matter what's happened to you. The things that have happened to you may not be your fault, but healing can occur. Your brain can be reshaped, the neuroplasticity of your brain, and you have a responsibility for that. Healing is your responsibility. And if you don't, then no one else will. And so that leads us then to another real key critical area and time in our brains, and that's what we refer to as adolescence. And so beginning at puberty, the brain is reshaped. I love the saying that during adolescence, we lose about half of our mind. Well, we've differentiated between mind and brain, but let me tell you actually what happens. Eventually, more than 40% of old brain pathways are eliminated, and the brain becomes more specific in adolescence. And this process is finally completed in our 20s. So the adolescent brain is an interesting thing. It can be compared to a high-performance sports car. It's fast, it's powerful, and it takes risky turns without utilizing the brakes. And so, welcome to adolescence. And so during adolescence, let me just describe to you more about the adolescent brain or the behaviors in adolescence. And so during adolescence, their behavior can be described as confused, annoying, demanding, moody, defiant, or reckless. They tend to be more unhappy than ever. Feelings feel so big. They learn to cope with new sexual impulses and romantic feelings during this time. They seek new experiences and thrill-seeking activities that produce strong feelings and sensations. And they will take higher risks when their friends are watching them. So here's what we need to know during adolescence is our adolescents' worth isn't based on their behavior. And so we're anticipating some of the behavior like what we talked about. And it's really important to also make note that psychosis and eating disorders and addictions are more likely to take hold during this time. And if you think about the feelings, remember we talked about during adolescence, the feelings, normal feelings seem so big. And let's just imagine that an adolescent, or if it's you started using to try to calm yourself or to try to fit in and actually became addicted. When you or that person gets off of the addiction and off of the substances, then they still don't know how to cope with the big feelings. And you actually have to learn the skills that you need as you go through adolescence. If you missed this developmental stage and you utilized substances, or if things were chaotic and there was a lot of trauma, then ultimately, then that has to be revisited and those skills have to be obtained. But if the things start during adolescence, the addiction to cigarettes or nicotine, or again, eating disorders, drugs, alcohol, whatever those things are, there's a lot more prevalency for addiction if they're started during this time because of what's going on in the brain. And then surveys show that everyday unhappiness, this is one of those things, again, the big feelings, that everyday unhappiness reaches its peak during adolescence. But my encouragement with the big feelings is even though it feels really big, there's no reason to do something that could affect or impact your life permanently for a temporary solution or a temporary situation, because this too shall pass. And so our adolescents and we as caregivers need to know that adolescents need to maintain a connection with safe adults in their life. There's been numerous amounts of studies and research that show if there's just a lifeline with somebody that truly knows them and truly cares and checks in with them, then that can make all the difference in the world. They also need to know that it's natural to be drawn to friends and to have heartache with fragile peer relationships during this time. The bond between the mom and the adolescent shifts before this time, then a lot of times there's the biggest connection with the mom or with the parent. And then now as the adolescent is exploring and developing into who they're going to be, again, then they're looking for other connections, and the value of the other connections then will seem like so much greater of a value that's placed on those than with parents or the people that they'd had previously. And during this time, what about all the hormones, the adrenal stress hormones, the sex hormones, the growth hormones? These two are all being poured out. They're coming on board. And again, this too shall pass. And so in this transitional time with what's happening in the adolescent's brain, it's really important that the adolescent doesn't do anything that could permanently hinder the rest of their lives. And so those big feelings, and we think about suicidal ideation, or the big feelings, and we think about drugs and alcohol and experimentation. And so just a really, really important time. And so I guess what I want to ask you is, how is your brain? What happened? Who had access to your brain when you first entered into this world for the formative years of your life? And then what was going on during adolescence? What did you do during adolescence? And so it doesn't matter, again, about how bad it was or what didn't happen or coulda, shoulda, woulda. The past is the past. What's going to be really important now for all of us is what we're going to do about it today. The thoughts that we think today actually will build the brain that we will wake up with tomorrow. And so we need to think about beautiful thoughts. And so what about your brain health? Our brain health can be because of issues and the unresolved trauma and the unresolved sin and the subconscious choices or the conscious choices that we continue to make. And so now it's going to be really just a really hard work that we have to do to heal our brain, to transform our mind and our thinking patterns that ultimately will have an effect on our brain. And so I think right now would be a really good time. Of course, I think any time's a good time to see a brain image. But let me just show you this brain image. So we have a normal brain. And remember, the brain is a 3-pound mass, and it's soft. The consistency is like a soft butter. And the brain in the middle is a picture of a brain scan from a cocaine addict. And then if you'll see on the other side, this is a picture of a porn addict. And so again, what we put into our body, what the chemicals that are released that surround our brain, the emotions that we have, particularly if you'll look with the porn addict, the things that we look at, what we behold, we become. And if you think about the middle part of your brain, the part that's supposed to be connected with God in our imagination and for imagining our future or for our emotions. And if we're exposed to pornography, or if we're exposed to drugs or alcohol or trauma or those things at an early age, then what is going to shape our emotions and what's going to shape our imagination? We spend 30% of our time daydreaming. We are meant to imagine and to be creative and to do that with Jesus. But what about if now we have an addiction? Because as you can clearly see in the porn brain, that this is an addiction. And we can think about, is this a moral issue, or just say no? Well, just say no really work initially if this is what our brain looks like with the addictions of drugs or pornography. And so as we go through life, we may not have our brains that look like this with drugs or pornography, but what are the things that are not healthy and not optimal in our life? And again, we go back to, well, how do I know what's optimal? So do you remember Hitch? So here it is. Right here is our zone. Right here is where you need to be. When you're bumped into, then you need to have the fruit of the Spirit that spills out. And that needs to be what's inside of you, because you behold Jesus and you become like him and you're part of him. And the fruit of the Spirit will know by the fruits, the fruit of the Spirit under pressure. When you're squeezed, that's what spills out of you. And then the other sign that we know that we're healthy or we're unhealthy, about Philippians 4:8. What are we allowed to think about? Things that are pure and praiseworthy and noble and right and just and lovely. And so what about when somebody bumped into me and the fruit of the Spirit didn't spill out, but something else that was really ugly spilled out? Or what about my thought processes? Hopefully by this point in this series, you've been thinking about what you're thinking about. And what if those things aren't pure and praiseworthy and noble and right? You're going to have to now do the hard work. We could go to the gym and decide that we're going to get in shape, and we could go to the parking lot, or we could walk through the gym and never consistently do the work. And if we decide to go to the gym, what if I went to the gym one day and I exercised, and then I went back home, and the next day I got in front of the mirror and said, well, I tried it and it didn't work. We all know that this is going to take time. So I want to encourage you now that we're going to have some exercises, that you're going to have to develop a system. You're going to have to put the right practices in the system. Your brain is going to have to expend more energy. You're going to have to think about what you're thinking about. You're going to have to utilize more calories. It actually is going to look worse before it gets better, because you're going to bring the subconscious to the consciousness to develop this system until eventually the system becomes automatic, and you can then this system will be filed into your subconscious, and you will establish these behaviors, and they will become like second nature. It's just like when you get up in the morning, do you brush your teeth or not? And so for me, it's second nature. And so that's what this is going to eventually be. But initially, again, it's going to look like it gets worse before it gets better, because you were in denial. You didn't pay attention to what you were thinking about. You just pushed those things aside. You just suppressed or repressed them. But then they would have permission to come up or spill out at any point or at any time. And then you created a world around dysfunction. And more often than not, then the people that are in your life, if you were dysfunctional and if you were a hot mess, then that's what you're going to attract. Secure people won't tolerate for very long insecure people or insecurely attached people. People that are anxious or avoidant or fearful. And so this is going to be a process that's really going to take quite a bit. But the good news is that time's going to go by regardless, and you might as well be working on this. And so you need, in the middle of all of this, to value the process. It's not about when you get somewhere. When you get somewhere, when you think you're going to be at the finish line, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be a whole new course in front of you with a whole nother finish line. And so it will be one destination after another, after another, after another, if you look at it like that. And so you aren't looking to get somewhere or to obtain something. You are actually looking for personal growth in the moment, in the day, every hour of every day. So it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. It's about increasing your capacity to be like Him, being transformed by the renewing of your mind, establishing new behaviors, allowing those behaviors to become part of your subconscious. And so it's a process of renewing our mind versus being in a hurry for the outcome. Why are you in a hurry? And if all of a sudden you get picked up from where you are and you get dropped at the end of this finish line, and then you're in step for the next race that's going to happen, you didn't build up what you needed to between the beginning of the race and the end of the race, and you won't have the skills at the next level. And so I think about if we put our kids, if we would just grab our kids and we would drop them in middle school, and then we would just then say, oh, sweetie, you can just not worry about middle school. I know you want to be in high school. So we pick them up where they're at and we drop them into high school. They will not have achieved and obtained what they needed in those formative years in middle school, in not only the skill levels with mathematics and English and science, but then also the maturity level. So if we think we're going to fast forward it and we're going to skip over the steps or the hard work, we won't have the skills that's needed and necessary at the next level. And so this is a lifelong thing. It's not a one and done. And so in this process, particularly with our brain, we're going to have the preparation and the separation. The preparation and the separation. The preparation is that we're going to feed ourselves. We're going to behold the living Christ. We're going to prepare ourselves. We're going to think about the things that we're thinking about, the things that are pure and lovely. We're going to prepare ourselves for what goes into our brain. We're going to pay attention to what we're watching and what we're listening to and who's in our environment. And then we're going to separate ourselves from the things that are negative, those thought processes, those people that aren't healthy, those activities that we don't need to be doing, the things that we don't need to be watching, the things that we don't need to be listening to. So in other words, we're going to feed new neural pathways and forge our way and cut and blaze new trails with new neural pathways in our brain, and we're going to starve out the others. And that's just all there is to it. It's a lot of hard work, and everybody wants the outcome, or so they think, but they don't always want to do the work that's required. And so people say that I wish, and then people will say that I will. And the ones that say that they wish and the people that say that they will are two totally different things. These are worlds apart. There is a vast difference between I wish and I will. I wish and I will. And so I want to encourage you, don't be the one that wishes. Be the one that will, that you will do it. And so how long does it take? How long am I going to have to do this? And right out of the gate, I'll just tell you, I really think that's a wrong question. Again, time's going to happen regardless. And it's not you're going to do this until, it's actually you're going to have to do this the rest of your life. And so if you wash your clothes, it's not a one and done. If you brush your teeth, it's not a one and done. If you've showered, you're going to have to shower for the rest of your life. If you like to make your bed every day, you made it today, then you're going to have to make it tomorrow. So it's not even a matter of how long is this going to take. If I want to stay physically fit, then I'm going to exercise today and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and actually for the rest of my life. But if you really want to have push come to shove, how long is it going to take, even though we know that time is going to go by regardless? So subconsciously, I'm bringing it to the consciousness. I'm focusing on it. I know that it takes 21 days to create a new pathway while starving the old pathway. And it's going to take at least 63 days to make it a habit. I know that it could take 400 repetitions. We say, oh, I did this once. Oh, I did this twice. Oh my gosh, I did this 10 times. Oh, even worse than that. What if it takes 400 times? But I also know that if you can make it fun, if you could have a good attitude about this, then it actually takes a lot less time. Regardless of whether I want to or not, I have to do 5 to 6 days of at least 45 minutes of cardiovascular stretching and strengthening exercises this week, next month, next year, and for the rest of my life. And so this is no different. And again, research shows that if we find something that's fun in this, then it's going to take a lot less repetitions. And so it's really going to be about our attitude. So if we have some stink attitude about having to go through all of this, again, you're defeating the purpose, because what are you supposed to be thinking about? Things that are pure and praiseworthy and lovely and noble. And so as I was going to exercise, even yesterday, I'm thanking God for my shoes, that I have really good running shoes, that I have really good socks that'll prevent blisters, that I have the equipment and the things that I need. And so it's all about attitude. And I have a community of people that are doing this as well. And we hold each other accountable. And it's not if we're going to do this, it's when are we going to exercise today? And so if you put things in place, again, the preparation phase, that you put things in place, that this is what you're going to do regardless, and you take the choice out of it, then you'll be a lot better off and ahead. And so in the middle of all this, we don't have to expect perfection. And so we're going to do what we can do today and not get discouraged when it looks worse than it looks better. Because if we do what we can do today, we can do then tomorrow what we couldn't do today because of what we did today. And that's just how the process is. So there are no shortcuts. There's no quick fix. There's no microwave. There's nobody that we can really blame. It's that we're going to do the hard work. And so now I want to tell you a story. I really, really like this story. There was a group of people that got together and they decided that they wanted to go and see the summit. And so it reminds me, not too long ago, we were over in Nepal and we actually took a helicopter to Annapurna Base Camp in the Himalaya mountains. And it was one of the most breathtaking, most beautiful, gorgeous things that I'd ever seen. And in this story, I'm going to introduce to you something called a tea house. And until I was in Nepal, I'd never been to a tea house. And so when you hike along the way, there are tea houses, and they're just really, really simple structures that you can go into and you can warm up. There's always a fire, and then there's hot tea. And then there's a really nourishing meal, a healthy, nourishing meal that you can eat in these tea houses. And so this group of people got together and they had the common denominator that they wanted to hike a really, really difficult mountain, and they wanted to see the summit. And so they began to train. And as they trained, they began to explore what the best equipment was. And they decided that they were all really, really serious. And so they hired trainers, personal trainers, and they would do group practices and group training, and they would do individual training. And they did this day after day and week after week and month after month for a solid year. And now the time had finally come. They had all of the equipment that they needed. They were in shape. They were ready to rumble. They were looking forward to this vision of the summit. They had a picture of what they wanted to do and what they wanted to become. And every single day for a year, they made choices based on, will this choice that I make today help me achieve that or hinder me from achieving that? And if it was neutral, they didn't make the choice. So not making a choice or doing something neutral didn't even count towards that would help them achieve that thing. And so they were ready to go. And so they went to the destination of where they were going to start. They met their guides. They had hired guides. The hired guide got them ready. They had all of their equipment on, and they started their hike. And as they went along, they were getting fatigued, and it was actually harder than what they thought. And they started to get blisters, and they were really, really hungry. And as they rounded this corner, they actually saw a tea house. And they could see the smoke coming up from the chimney at the tea house. And they started to have the aroma of food. And they were so excited. And the guide said, this will be our break. This is halfway. This is our halfway point to going up the rest of the mountain. And then you will see what you've been training for the last year. You will see the summit. And so that gave them a little bit more pep in their step, and they finished out, landed at the tea house, took all of their gear off. They were exhausted. They started tending to their blisters and their sore feet and their wounds, and they sat down and they relaxed. They warmed up by the fire and the smell of food. They were really, really hungry. They began to eat, and as they were eating and as they were drinking, they noticed that there were games over in the shelves by the fireplace. They got the games out. They started to play games. They started to eat the dessert. They were full. They were warm. They were happy. And then the guide that had taken them to that point came in and thanked them and wished them well and said, and now I'm going to introduce you to your second guide, who will take you actually on the hardest part of the trail, but he will actually be the one that takes you to the summit. And they all looked at each other and they all started to think, oh my gosh, the second part of the trail, the hardest part of the trail, I don't know if I want to finish. And do you know that even though they'd prepared for a year, even though they had everything that they needed, they had the guide, they had one another, they were fed, they were absolutely capable of going to the summit, half of the people decided not to get their shoes back on over their sore feet and over their blisters, not to put their gear back on, but half of them stayed in the tea house. So half of them got dressed. They moaned and they groaned as they were putting on their shoes. They pulled their gear on and they started back out on the trail with the new guide, ready to do whatever it took to see the summit. And those that sat back for a little while were glad they'd made the right choice. They started to eat even more desserts, or they'd go stand by the fire, or they would sit back and relax. And some of them took just a quick nap. But after about an hour, and then especially 2 hours and 3 hours, as they sat there, they began to wonder, I wonder what it's like. I wonder where they are. I wonder what it'll be like when they get to the summit. I wonder. And then eventually they could only eat so much. They could only nap so long. They could only tend to and care for their feet for such amount of time. And eventually they started to go over to the window and wish and wonder. And so I want to just encourage all of us is that we have to do this thing. And you can't get into it and then decide not to. This is a daily discipline that you're going to need to do for the rest of your life. The consequences of sin is death. And Jesus was really pretty clear. Either we're going to follow him or not. When we're bumped into, it's a fruit of the Spirit. These are the things that we're allowed to think about. And now if we don't accept responsibility, if we just do it halfway, if we just do it for a while and decide that it's hard, then we're not going to make it all the way. We're not going to see the summit. And so I just want to, again, encourage us that it's a lifetime. And those that did see the summit knew what it was like. That's what they were born for. That's what they were created for. That's what they prepped for. We're meant to see the summit. We're meant to be in the light. We're meant to be with him. We're meant to be different. And if we're not willing to then crucify our flesh. If it's no longer I, but the Spirit within, as we've been crucified with Christ, if we're not willing to do what he says, then there will be some really serious consequences, but the choice then is up to us. And so I want to give you a few exercises that I really need for you to do. I want you then to start to think about what you're thinking about. And so I think about on my phone, I have a fitness application. I have a fitness application on my watch, so I know how many calories I burn. I track my exercise. I track the things that I do. And so my saying with me is if it goes in my mouth, it goes in my phone. And so on my fitness application, I can scan in the barcode to see what I'm eating and the quality of the food that I'm eating and how many calories I'm eating and what level of protein. And so again, if it goes in my mouth, it goes in my phone. And so over this next week, I want you to start to journal and to think about what you're thinking about. And again, you know the standard, you know the basic principles. So here's our standard. This is our goal. This is where we want to get. But we're going to have to bring the subconscious to the consciousness, think about it. And then ultimately, you're going to have to make the adaptations. You're going to have to starve and you're going to have to prepare new neural pathways. And the beginning part of that is to start to journal what you're thinking about. And ultimately, I'm going to invite you into a brain fast. What you behold, you become. And so maybe your imagination, and you're used to thinking about this, you're used to daydreaming about this, and you know that it's not really the best thing. Or again, with this, if it's neutral, something that's neutral or not making a choice is a choice towards the things that will not benefit us. And so it's either going to benefit us or it's not. Not making the choice in something that could be neutral is going to go into the not category for these exercises. And so what you behold, you become. And so I want you to journal what is shaping your brain for the next week. So are you looking at social media? Are you looking at pornographic images? Are you looking at what are you watching on television? What you spend an hour doing a day for the next 5 years will actually become what you will be an expert in. And so what are you watching? And is it adding to your brain growth and development? Is it edifying for your mind? Or is it neutral, or even worse than that, is it causing some destructive neural pathways to be developed and reinforced in your brain? And then what are you listening to? What music are you listening to? Is it edifying? Is it pure and praiseworthy and noble and right and just? Does it thrust you towards Jesus? And again, if it's neutral, then it goes into the other category. Who are you around? And what are you allowing people to talk about? And if somebody is talking smack, or if they're being negative and you just listen, you don't even agree, you just listen, then that's also negative. If you don't say anything, if you don't stop it, you are actually adding to that thing. What messages do the people that you're around give? Do they thrust you towards Jesus and your destiny? Do they see who you are and what you're going to become? Or are they negative? And so during this time, as you're reshaping your brain, again, who has access to your brain is going to be really, really critical. And I'm going to encourage you into a time of fasting, to fast from the old things, to starve the old pathways, and then to feed the new pathways. If we fast from old things, we'll create a vacuum, and something will fulfill that vacuum. And so you need to be really, really clear about what's going to be brought into that hole, into that gap in your life. And you have to plan for that thing ahead of time, or just anything could come, and it could be actually something worse than what you were doing originally. And so what are you feeding your brain? So think about it, like in my mouth, in my phone. So think about what's going into your brain, and you're going to feed your brain the things that your brain needs to be fed. And then I want you to do your midbrain, your soil preparation. You have got to activate your imagination and your emotions with Jesus. So we talked about the soil and the seeds that were planted, and if there were thistles, or if there were rocks, or if the seeds could be taken away or choked out. So I'm going to invite you to do some really good midbrain activities with Jesus as you study the scriptures and as you activate your imagination and you go with him throughout your days and you ask him, so where were you, Jesus, during this day? And what did you have to say to me? And activate that part. You've got to do the work, not only intellectually, but then in your midbrain level. And so as you're going to process all of these things with Jesus, process the scriptures and the gospels and your day. And then I also want you to start to think about what you're thinking about and what you're worried about. I want to see if you can find a common denominator or common theme with your thought processes and your thought patterns. Is there something that you're worried about? Remember that 20-lane highway that you've created in your brain. If you think something bad's always going to happen, or they're going to leave me, or I can't trust them, or whatever that negative thing is, I want you to start to journal as you think about what you're thinking about. And if you process every day and then begin to journal those things that weren't pure and praiseworthy and noble and right and just, let's see if we can find some patterns about the things that you've created, the highways and the systems in your brain that you've created because of the past and what you've thought about. And so as we think about these things, the things that are pure and praiseworthy and noble, a homework activity that I want you to do is to find a story in the New Testament. And I like to do this with the Gospels. And I want you to think about, what are you intrigued about? What is a question that you would have? Or you may just want to start in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John and just begin to read. And as you to activate the middle part of your brain, to start to imagine, to start to have emotions about, to start to wonder, as you meditate on the scriptures with curiosity, it activates the limbic system. And again, the limbic system is the middle part of your brain. The actual idea of meditation literally is to ponder, to dwell on, to mutter scripture to ourselves so that it starts to take root in our heart. Now, you should know as well as I do what the heart is. It's not our heart that pumps blood. It's the middle part of our brain. And so these are going to be really important, just quick exercises that I need you to do every day. Just find something in your manuals. You have scriptures that you could meditate on, but I think it's better if you really get a story. And what does that story look like? What does that story feel like? For me, John 21, I love that story about Peter when he's being restored by Jesus. And these are the things that I need you to start to do, to think about these things. You can utilize curiosity, a midbrain response, to think about the scriptures. So as you, again, ponder, mutter, review, dissect, ask questions, and pick apart the words, you can get new revelation, clarification, or interpretation for current situations. This roots and grounds us in Jesus. This is really, really good activities that we can do to shape our middle part of our brain. So meditation on the scriptures, meditation on things that are pure and lovely and praiseworthy and right and noble and just are shown to be effective in decreasing social anxiety and increasing your attention to, they're effective as a tool to fight addiction and used to prevent relapses. And so in this concludes what I want you to know about the brain in general. We've talked about the three parts of your brain. Your brain is organized for survival and simplicity. But now I need you to start to do the work. So make sure that you're in the scriptures. Make sure that you're going over and imagining what was happening there. Make sure that you're making it applicable for your everyday, regular life. And as we're doing this, we're going to starve old neural pathways. We're going to feed new pathways. And as we do this day after day and week after week and month after month, and you're going to do this for the rest of your lives, really, quite frankly, then you're going to see growth. But initially, it might be a lot more difficult. It's harder to connect with Jesus. It's harder to read the word. It's harder to do these things than it was the other things, because your brain is organized for simplicity, just become subconscious things that you don't have to think about. You don't have to expend calories. And then that is not the most optimal for you. And so be sure and do your homework in this area. Start these processes that will eventually become a habit and a pattern in your life that you'll just naturally do on a daily basis. And then I'm going to see you in the next 3 classes, where we're going to talk about, in 2 classes, the amygdala, and then finally the reticular activating system, as we are going through the psychoeducation of the CPR process. I'll see you in the next class.